Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Here we shall discuss the Great Wall and the abduction of Europa. In particular, we're going to be talking about the mythological plot of this, abduction of Europa, etc., etc. And I shall try to show you that it seems to be a pretty archetypal type of mythological plot, and it really has a lot of relevance even to the politics of modern day. So it sort of like sends these waves of tsunami across the whole culture of today. And of course, Europa has, a lot of relevance to Europe, meaning the continent, and I shall utilize this similarity later. So the classic example of this type of myth is, of course, the abduction of Europa itself, which is basically, so there's this daughter of a Phoenician king, apparently, named Europa, whom Zeus abducts, kidnaps, basically, and moves to Crete, whereas Zeus himself was in the form of a bull during this procedure, so to speak. And then on Crete, Zeus performs, let's say, certain X-rated type of activities with Europa, and later she gives birth to, Minos, the mythological or legendary king of Crete, etc., etc. And later you have Minotaur there and other fancy stuff. So anyway, one important note I wish to make here is that before we go on with the further discussion, is that I'm not going to be talking about history, rather I'm talking about mythology, obviously. So I shall utilize the version of history, again, see my comment about that in Science and Anarchy video, basically our current adopted version of history written by Jesuits in the 16th century. So because this version of history is really working in our culture today, so all of our perceptions are infused with this type of historical narrative. So in mythological sense, it's real, because we perceive it as real, essentially. So yeah, so the basic scheme of this mythological plot, I believe, has three important elements. So the first element is that we have this power sort of overwhelmed with energy, filled with energy, a sort of chaotic power. In this case, it's obviously Zeus, right, in this particular case. But the second element is that we have, at the same time, a sort of a cherished and protected treasure, which is represented in this case by this noble young woman named Europa. And the third thing that we have in this myth is basically this chaotic power, Zeus in this case, overstepping all the boundaries and basically destroying this treasure, or sort of like corrupting it, basically putting its filthy hands on it, something like that. So in terms of sort of Dungeons and Dragons type of thing, you might say it's the fight between chaos and order. So you have an order, which is this protected, valued treasure, and you have chaos, this entity that is overwhelming with power, and the chaos sort of rapes the order, by nullifying everything of value in it. So this is the basic scheme of this myth. And obviously, as I've said, Europa has, it's basically the same name as the continent Europe, and Europe in the modern day mythology has this property of being like a cradle of civilization, almost a cradle of rationality, this aesthetic and intellectual discipline, you might say, as Europe is a place, again, according to current mythology, current Western world mythology, you might say, Europe is a place where rational, free individuals sort of like coexist in this harmony, societal harmony, etc., etc. So, and as such, it is obviously a value in itself, right? And a value like that, according to this mythology of the abduction of Europa, obviously produces the counter argument, so to speak, the image of this chaotic defiling force, you know, so that would seek to destroy whatever is valued and cherished, well, by Europeans, let's say. And a good example, like probably the first example even of let's say of this myth being utilized in the actual history, again, see my comment about history above, is the Persian invasion in Greece. So it's probably, I would say, again, according to Jesuit version of history, it was probably actually the very inception of this myth of the abduction of Europa. And one piece of evidence to support this claim that I might bring is the fact that, for example, both Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, and Herodotus, the Greek historian, they both mention both of these things. So they both talk about Persian invasion, like Aeschylus, for example, has this tragedy, Persians, and they both also mention this myth, the abduction of Europa. So they probably coincide in time somewhat. I mean, the myth and the production of the myth, and also the Persian invasion. And so basically what happened during Persian invasion, again, according to the Jesuit version of history, is that Greek policies basically tried to unite under a single banner to push off, like to defend themselves against this invasion of Persians. And so they start this tradition, this mythological tradition of the abduction of Europa. And you might think about other connected myths to this, like, for example, 300 Spartans, which I've already mentioned, I think, in my lever of speculation video, Archimedes' lever. And this myth about 300 Spartans seems to be originating in the same era, the time of Persian invasion. And like in this myth, in 300 Spartans, or legend if you like, we have this narrative about the heroic few, you know, noble people, Spartans, and obviously there were not only there were Spartans, but there were many other people with them, but still it's like heroic few fighting off this almost infinite horde of Persians, right? This basically horde of chaos, these, you know, stupid, cruel, and filthy Persians. And so another example of something similar we might see in, and again, like Greece itself was perceived as Europa in some sense, right? So it's this chaotic force of Persians that tried to invade and defile, corrupt, destroy everything of value, which was Greece itself in this case, right? It's basically Greek civilization. And at the same time, we have similar example with the Trojan War, right? Where there was literally an act of abduction of Helen of Troy by the, well, Helen was really from Sparta again, but it was abducted by Trojans. And so we have this similar narrative of Troy being depicted as this barbaric city, as like a society of scoundrels or something, against whom the noble Greeks, you know, this sort of like this orderly element was fighting, right? Even though obviously Troy itself wasn't really a barbaric city, it was a pretty decent civilization, a pretty regular Mediterranean society. not in any shape or form worse than Athens, for example, right? But still, this narrative of abduction of Europa, how I call it, it forces us to perceive Troy as this, barbaric nest, basically. So, and the same story, like after the downfall of Greece, the same story became a blight of Rome. Rome kind of took this baton of whatever civilization, I guess. So the leitmotif of the whole Roman history is basically this constant struggle against the barbarians, right? So barbarians are, for Rome, the same type of chaotic force that tries to invade and like destroy everything of value. And we might think about other examples like this Spanish Reconquista or, crusades. It's basically an attempt. It has a lot of similarities to Trojan War. So we're basically, it's like people who consider themselves as Europeans, so to speak, try to reclaim their values that were corrupted and let's say, destroyed, partly at least, by these filthy barbarians who are like Muslims or whatever, right? And by the way, there are like certain alternative versions of history, like Morozov's New Chronology, which was popularized by Fomenko and others. They actually state that crusades and Trojan War are the same thing, right? Because, well, the first crusade was actually in the same region where Troy is, the how do you say it? Small Asia, whatever, Turkey, basically, right? So, anyways, it's the same type of thing that I've called repentive thinking. An attempt, crusades and Trojan War and Reconquista, etc. It's the attempt to rectify the ill doings of the past, this act of corruption from this whatever chaotic power we're dealing with. And so in Eastern Europe, we have the same type of narrative where we have these, evil nomads, and it's also true for the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire. So this eternal fight against the nomads, Khazars or Mongols or whatever, it's also like an eternal blight of Eastern Europeans. It's the same story fundamentally. And even in Far East, in places like China, there's the same type of mythology at work, like where Chinese national myth is basically based on this idea that China is this center of civilization, this sort of its own private Europe, paraphrasing the title of Gus Van Sant's movie. So they have these dirty barbarians, for example, Hunnu, or I don't know, like what's the proper English name of these people, like Xiongnu, I don't know, it's like XIONGNU or something like that. So basically the same type of nomads. Or you might think of Kublai Khan's Mongols, or you might think about the Manchurians, etc. So China, sort of like, according to its national myth, it perceives itself as this Europe of the Far East, which is also almost like Rome, constantly invaded by these hordes of barbarians, this chaotic force, as I've called it, right? And kind of relating to the title of this video, the Chinese have their national myth also supported by this idea of the Great Wall, which is like a symbol of protection from these chaotic hordes, all right? So they've tried to protect their own private Europe with this wall, essentially. And similar story, you might say, have, well, not like happened, but is present in Japan, where, you know, this mythology of kamikaze, this god, like divine wind that basically saved Japan from the Mongol invasion. Also, kamikaze is essentially the same thing as the Great Wall in mythological sense. It's like this sort of almost a divine entity that protects you, right? That doesn't allow the abduction of Europa to happen, essentially. Right? So, as you can see, hopefully, the abduction of Europa is the logical base for the myth about the Great Wall. Like, the Great Wall is basically the thing that prevents the abduction of Europa from happening. And also the same is true for, you know, 300 Spartans, and they are also kind of the Great Wall in the of its own, so to speak, in themselves. And I wish to talk a little bit with regards to all of that with I wish to talk about some of the movies, or actually, let me mention first a couple of other related myths. Like, again, as I've said, 300 Spartans is like this personalized version of a Great Wall, or in reverse, you might think about it. The Great Wall is like solid 300 Spartans in stone, so to speak. And so there are other similar myths in other civilizations. And like, really, it seems like an archetypal pattern. Or at least I think it is. Like, again, I've already mentioned kamikaze. There's also, again, Roman limes, you know, these huge lines of fortifications, like Hadrian's Wall in Britain, or more like in Scotland, right? And there's obviously the English Channel for the British themselves. It acts like this Great Wall. It's like an analog of a Great Wall, basically. Or you might think about the Russian myth about Panfilov's 28 men, who are like, so basically the idea is that as Germans were, well, really not only Germans, but Nazis in general, were advancing towards Moscow, and like in late November of 1941, so it's like this myth that there was like a small group of men that held the advancement of the Germans and like bought some time for the Russian, I mean the Soviet troops to regroup, etc., etc. So Moscow was saved essentially because of that. So it's the same type of mythology as in 300 Spartans, and it has been proven that it's basically a propagandist myth. It didn't really happen. Like, something similar did happen here and there. Like, there were really heroic fights on the side of the Soviets, but there were no Panfilov's 28 men, basically. Or in my country, we have this Brest fortress, which also apparently like held for at least a month, I think. So basically, the garrison, they were completely surrounded. Like, the German troops have advanced already like hundreds of kilometers from that place, but this fortress like held for some time. So it's an important part of our national mythology in Belarus. And we also have similar thing with Slutsk gates. Slutsk is a very funny name of the city if you spell it in English, obviously, but anyway, so there is this mythology that, again, we've had these fortifications kind of protecting us from evil barbarians. Slutskaya Brama, as we call it in Belarusian. Слуцкая брама, непорушный мур, Слуцкая брама, светка авантур. Усё это. And so let's talk about the movies that are related to this subject. Like, again, obviously the 300 Spartans are probably the most modern depiction of this myth is the movie 300 by Zack Snyder. I think it came out in 2006 or something. And we shall also discuss the movie Great Wall by, again, Zhang Yimou I don't know the proper pronunciation, sorry. So this Chinese director. So in these movies, this archetypal pattern that I'm talking about is really shown in this grotesque, almost caricaturized form, and it's really pronounced, like it's really easily seen. So that's why I propose you to consider them. It's sort of this mimetic imagery. So in the movie 300, again, this mythological pattern is very well seen. So the Persians there are depicted as these, basically degenerates, these kind of warped, almost unnatural people, like the imagery is very like striking in this movie, like it's hyperbolized to a large degree. So you can really see how this myth envelops itself, kind of evolves in the sense of, opens itself up to you, so to speak. So yeah, and the Spartans who oppose Persians are depicted as almost these, like super brave, super strong, almost like Nordic men, almost like Leni Riefenstahl type of men, which is kind of funny because, I mean, it's such an unnatural thing to depict like Southern Europe, Greece as this sort of Nordic country. I mean, what? I mean, Southern Europe is sort of like a very sanguinic type of place, it's really bizarre to see it depicted in these dark Nordic tones, etc. So yeah. And and what's interesting here is that, for example, Xenophon, the student of Socrates, he actually, in his book Cyropedia, which is like supposedly a biography of Cyrus the Great, the king of Persians, it's, well, like how true it is, it's the subject of debate. But anyway, Xenophon actually depicts Persians in this book as actually the almost like paragons of virtue, So in some sense, he depicts them as actually Spartans, So it's a very stark contrast of how this myth of 300 Spartans, or the abduction of Europa, if you like, again, forces us to perceive Persians as these horrible monsters and like degenerate barbarians, whereas the Greeks themselves, on other occasions, actually depicted Persians as again, paragons of virtue. So yeah, so we're dealing with mythology here. That's basically my point. And yeah, so, and in the Great Wall movie, what we have is this, they actually went even farther in this mythology, and they actually didn't even depict this chaotic power that were invading as people. They've actually depicted it as a bunch of, like a horde of bloodthirsty and stupid Zerg, basically, these sort of animals, like fantastic animals, or something like that. Fantastic in the sense of being a product of fantasy, and not in the sense that they're very good in any respect, right? And so, yeah, so we have this heroic defense of the Great Wall in this movie. And again, it's so caricaturized, even the people who protect the wall are depicted as these stupid, stupid in the sense of how it looks to a rational eye, like these Power Rangers, just look at how they're dressed, etc., etc. So it's all very comic book-ish, right? Almost like superheroes again. So we have these Power Rangers defending the Chinese Europe from the stupid Zerg, who kind of just swarm around and try to break through. And I believe that at the same time we can say that well, so it's basically the very distilled, simplified form of the same myth of the abduction of Europa. And at the same time, what is shown there in this movie is this, like a nod towards the recognition of China as a European type of state, you know, because, and I believe it's like the reemergence of the layers of propaganda that were spread during the colonization of China by Europeans in like 16th to, let's say, 19th century, where the Chinese national myth was being produced, let's say. So you might see in this movie how it's actually the Europeans are sort of like scoundrels and like these, you know, not very fancy people who come to China, and China is this like super glorious aristocratic society. So yeah, it's definitely this movie is part of this Chinese myth depicting China as the center of civilization, which again only appeared in like a few hundred years ago. And so okay, so another movie which I think is relevant to this whole mythology is District 9 by Neil Blomkamp, the South African director, and it's a really cool movie. Like I really recommend it if you haven't watched it. And you have the same type of mythology depicted in this movie also. You have these basically stupid, horrible, sick, and dirty aliens as a metaphor for, or rather as a fleshed out version of this general metaphor of this chaotic invading force, right? And so they basically, by their presence only, they defile the city where they are in, this District 9 in Johannesburg or somewhere near it. So we have here the same Abduction of Europa type of myth, where, and again, it's very characteristic that it's placed in Johannesburg out of all places, which Johannesburg is basically a city where, according to some accounts, let's say zombie apocalypse prevailed essentially. So it was invaded by all the, you know, when apartheid policy was abolished, basically the whole South Africa has changed, you know, white racism to black racism, and somehow people think it's okay now. But anyway, so places like Johannesburg were invaded by hordes of black people, and like it just really turned into a huge dump. So we have this again mythological scenario where this chaotic power, which was previously constrained by apartheid, etc., it invaded these sort of like clean and civilized European cityscapes, or like quasi-European, and yeah, turned them into this barbaric dump. So it's the same type of thing. It's the abduction of Europa, abduction of Europe in South Africa or something like that. And yeah, and like, yeah, it's a pretty strong symbolism in this movie. And or there are actually people who literally talk about the zombie apocalypse in South Africa, like Lee Herman, a modern writer, with his novels. Like one of them is, for example, a journal of South African zombie apocalypse. It's literally called that way. But anyway, I think that the whole thing about zombie apocalypse, like why are like things like Walking Dead series are so popular, it's not really connected to this mythology that I'm talking about. It's something different, I think. I think the zombie apocalypse, and I don't quite remember, I think I've heard this idea from someone else, but I think it's more related to the whole issue of juxtaposition, of opposition of a person to the society that we have in the culture of modernity. So basically, for example, if you think about the Romantic culture, the culture of Romanticism in like the first half of 19th century, it was all about that, about the person like opposed to the society, a person versus the society, right? So it's more about that. I mean, the zombie apocalypse topic. It's like you are alone, and there are these people who are sort of like, you know, these gray masses, and they kind of try to kill you or whatever, try to take your stuff away. Yeah, so I think the root of the zombie apocalypse popularity is somewhere here, rather than, you know, the Abduction of Europa type of myth. Although they are pretty similar, I would admit that. Okay, so let's go back to Europe itself. So in European Union, we pretty much have this statist slash socialistic insanity, which I've talked about in some detail in my videos about Archimedes' lever of speculation and some other one. What was the most recent one? I can't even remember them. Oh yeah, quality and quantity in economics. Okay, so yeah, we have this socialistic insanity in Europe, which leads to migrant crisis, obviously, because, well, they have this welfare state, right? Socialistic welfare state, which redistributes wealth towards parasites, essentially, people who don't do anything. And obviously, parasites from other countries want to move in. So that's what brings forth the migrant crisis in Europe. And at the same time, this crisis leads to renaissance of the same myth of the abduction of Europa. And like it brings forth this longing for abducted Europa, so to speak. It unwraps this feeling of injustice, or almost like sacrilege or blasphemy that takes place on European streets today. Like think about places like Brussels, which again is very quickly turning into a barbaric dump, or Paris, or even London, etc. And it's actually not only the European problem. I mean, in the US we have the same situation. Like large American cities are also turning into this barbaric dump. So for them, the scenario, the myth of abduction of Europa is also very actual. It's also a part of agenda. You know, think about places like Chicago or LA or Detroit or whatever. So again, so we have this sort of a desire to protect Europe as Europa, you know, from this abduction, but at the same time, some people actually see this what's happening as the sort of like a retribution for sins of Europeans in the past, and they keep like repenting. Again, see my video about repentive thinking. Like again, well, okay, Europeans were colonizing the world, etc., so they've done a lot of bad. I actually don't like. I agree that it has been not the coolest era, but it's still a subject of debate. Like maybe colonization actually brought something good at the same time. So it's not that black and white, I would say. But anyway, so some people indeed keep repenting for the sins of Europeans. I mean, people in Europe itself. And it's probably the most pronounced in Germany, and places like that, like Germany with its obviously funny political past. There are these types of tendencies. I mean, they've already they've kept repenting for like 70 years in front of Jews, etc. Now why don't repent in front of like the rest of the world? And so it all brings to the forefront of politics populists, obviously, who promise to keep Europa from being abducted, metaphorically speaking again. And they obviously, how do you keep Europa from being abducted? Well, just as I've said above, you build a great wall, right? You encircle your Europa in this wall. And I think only like a lazy person have not yet told a joke about, the Great Wall of Trump at the border of Mexico, etc. So the same patterns really prevail, or maybe not prevail, but they're easily observed in the US, again in Britain, again the whole Brexit thing. It's basically like, let's build a wall again, let's hide behind our English Channel, and like it would protect us from all the stupidity, from all the socialism and all the immigrants. And the same pattern also happens in Ukraine, for example, where Ukrainians try to build a wall at the border with Russia to protect themselves from this, nomadic hordes from Russia from invading. And it's actually a very old mythology. Basically, in all of the Europe, there's the same pattern observed. I think Slavoj Žižek mentioned that, like, take my country, for example. We think that, again, to the east of us are barbarians, Russians, or the Soviets, or whatever. They are frequently associated with these Mongol hordes. Basically most of Russia was occupied by these nomads at some point, whereas my country wasn't, for the most part at least. So we perceive ourselves as this, like a shield in front of Europe against these barbarians, Russian / Mongolian / whatever. Whereas if you look at Poland, they perceive themselves as a shield of Europe from barbarians, including us, Belarusians. And if you think about Germany, they perceive themselves as the shield of Europe from the barbarians, including Polish people, right? And if you think about France, they consider the rest of Europe as barbarians, including Germans, etc., etc. And the same thing is in the south. Like, Serbians think they're like the last fortress in front of Europe, protecting it from barbarians, like Albanians, etc. Like, Croatians think that they're the last fortress, like, protecting Europe from barbarians, including Serbians. Like, Austrians think that Croatians are also, and it's like Slovenians and etc. are also barbarians. Like, it's the same pattern. And the British actually think that all of Europe is like barbaric. It's like all of Europe is Balkans, basically, right? So it's pretty funny in this regard. Like, the same type of mythology pretty much everywhere. Like, it's pretty ridiculous. But anyway, so what was I talking about? Yeah, so this building of walls is basically trying to fight at one injustice, like this statism / socialism, with another injustice, like literally building walls, like preventing people or capital or goods from moving to and from these regions. So it basically makes everyone poorer in order to fight everyone already being poor due to socialism, right? So it's a pretty, again, typical pattern, something that you can expect to find on this road to serfdom, as Hayek calls it. His book Road to Serfdom, that shows that governments tend to increase the level of violence. So you have little violence, then you have more and more and more and more, because you need to solve problems that were caused by this initial violence, right? So you have to, like this avalanche of violence occurs until you basically end up in full totalitarian regime. And this is, I believe, what's going to happen both in Europe and America and basically all over the world. So, and like building of walls has I've already mentioned Germany. It has interesting, let's say, cultural impact on Germany itself, because they have their own like painful symbolism associated with walls. I mean, the Berlin Wall, obviously. But anyway, so other patterns connected to this mythology of abduction of Europa. Let's talk about some other things. Like, what's interesting is that Zeus was obviously the son of Kronos, Saturn, and I believe there was this Oedipal thing between them. Like, basically Zeus killed Kronos, or at least like castrated him or something like that. And I've already mentioned this pattern in my video about science and anarchy, this Freudian sort of interpretation of the whole process. And you might perceive the love affairs of Zeus as the same type of abduction of Europa, kind of repeated over and over. There was like tens of examples of that. And it has, I believe it is related to the whole idea of this chaotic man versus, the orderly woman. Again, like, it fits the basic narrative of abduction of Europa perfectly. And what's interesting here is that Zeus himself was born on Crete, where he later brought Europa to. And I believe that in general, everything like dark and subconscious and like strange was placed by Greeks in Crete. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of some lingering Egyptian influence there in Crete, I mean. But anyway, the most strange thing, the most subconscious thing that occurred in the Greek world was obviously Oedipus himself. And it didn't happen on Crete, it did happen in the continental Greece, where Oedipus had the same story as Zeus, essentially. So he kind of killed his father, and at the same time, Oedipus actually went farther than that. He actually abducted his own mother, he married his own mother. And there's obvious religious symbolism here. I think I've mentioned it in my mythology video, mythology as cultural basis, or somewhere else. I don't even remember now where. But also what we have in Oedipus myth is we have this realization of a sin, of a break. The kind of thing that I've talked about in my repentive thinking video. It might actually have been there in this video where I mentioned Oedipus. So Oedipus feels remorseful, and he kind of, for this sin, I mean, and he kind of experiences this sort of proto-Christian catharsis when he, dissolves into nothingness in the grove of Erinyes, these evil spirits. But anyway, so perhaps this break, this sin of Oedipus, perhaps it actually relates to the widespread, the spreading of Socrates' moralistic philosophy, which seems to be happening at roughly the same time. I mean, when Sophocles was, for example, writing his plays, his tragedies about Oedipus, like Oedipus Rex, Oedipus in Cologne, I don't know what the proper English transliteration is, and Antigone, the daughter of Oedipus, who kind of tends to him and kind of helps him to finish his life in a decent manner. So yeah, so what I'm saying, I guess, is that, as this Socratic moralistic philosophy was spreading, well, basically what it brought with itself was, and that's really an epoch when the Greek philosophy turned towards moral, right? It turned from the study of the world, as in pre-Socratic era towards the study of relationships between human beings, which is morality and ethics. So this rationalism and moralism of this philosophy, it has this accusational pathos. It puts the blame, or rather it intends to rectify people, to show them how they should behave. And in this sense, it's kind of accusatory. It says, you don't behave like that, you behave like that, right? This is bad, this is good. So it accuses people who don't comply with it as being bad, basically, right? So what I'm saying is that the plays of Sophocles, the tragedies of Sophocles, kind of depicted this painful transition to moralism. And obviously in his contemporary and like slight successor, you might say, Euripides, we actually experience the death of tragedy, like basically the ending of the genre. And Euripides was obviously highly influenced by Socrates. It's not a big surprise. Like, I'm basically following Nietzsche's ideas from his Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music book. So yeah, Euripides was signifying the death of tragedy through rationalism. And the already mentioned Xenophon, the student of Socrates, was obviously the part of the same Socratic wave. So his heroization of Persians that I've already mentioned in his Cyropedia, in contrast to demonization of Persians in the myth of about the 300 Spartans, it's actually, again, it's the same moralistic type of thing, like, this immoral youth of today is really corrupt. So take an example of Persians. They are really, noble and like virtuous people, etc. That was the point of Xenophon in this regard. And he actually loved Sparta too. And some of the best info on Spartan state that we have comes from Xenophon, because he lived there for like, 7 years, maybe something like that. So he was a fan of those at least apparently these highly structurized moralistic societies, something like that. So and in Xenophon's book Economicus, as it was translated by Cicero into Latin, we have pretty much the same idea. It's the same moralistic approach to how you should basically hold your household. Kind of sounds tautological, but anyway. So this scenario, this myth of abduction of Europa, it really depicts a man, well, in this case Zeus, as chaotic, whereas a woman is this treasure, this guarded and protected and cherished treasure, and it's very orderly, right? So we have a chaotic man versus orderly woman, and I believe that it serves as a basis for the whole culture of romantic love that we have, that appeared roughly in Middle Ages, or at least it seems to have appeared. Like, our culture of romantic love is really not eternal in this sense. It's really highly culturally determined. Again, it's probably only like 500 years old or something like that. The whole rituals of courtship, where a man needs to like pursue a woman. It almost looks like a siege. A man kind of tries to invade a woman's space, like he makes moves here and there, like he brings her gifts or whatever, and a woman's role in this process is to sort of hold her ground, like defend for some time, to like ramp up the tension, like to increase the passion, etc. And then in the end she needs to give up, So that's basically archetypal scenario of courtship that we have in the last 500 years or so. So, and it also, I believe, is related to this myth of the abduction of Europa. So what we have here is, and in some places like Caucasus and Central Asia, they literally abduct their wives. You know, it's a ritual how you basically propose, you know, to your woman is basically you just take her, like literally grab her and drag her to your place. I mean, in Russia, it's still practiced today, like in places like Chechnya, etc. And it's sometimes very funny to watch. I mean, it's really sort of like a barbaric ritual. But anyway, so I've already mentioned this opposition of chaotic man and orderly woman, right? And we have obviously the brilliant idea of John Gray, you know, who says that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. So in this case, we also have the recognition of the same mythological pattern of like passive women versus active men, you know, again, as depicted by the myth of the abduction of Europa. And we also have Robert Kagan with his book of Paradise and Power, where the same pattern is used to describe international relations. Like he basically says that United States are the man, you know, they are the Mars, and whereas Europe is a woman, it's like Venus, etc. And what's interesting is that Athena, whom, for example, Velikovsky associates with the planet Venus, was sort of rooting for Greeks during the Trojan War, whereas Ares, Mars, was rooting for Trojans. And you know that they've had, you know, like literally a battle in the sky, etc. So it's pretty fitting to the whole narrative, hopefully, that I've depicted in this video. So, and you might think about like many other examples of the same type of thinking, like the same type of abductions, so to speak. Like you might think about Nazi and Soviet occupation of Europe by, again, it's like this abduction of Europe, abduction of Europa. It's this invasion of this chaotic, barbaric power, right? Or you might think about murder of Franz Ferdinand that started the Great War. Also, Franz Ferdinand is like a Europa in himself. It's like a noble guy, etc., who was destroyed by these barbarians, you know, these Serbian terrorists, etc. Or you might think about the execution of Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor, but by, again, these barbaric Soviet people. So it all kind of feeds on the same mythological scenario of the abduction of Europa. And obviously, even the gender thingies that we have today with this, you know, supposedly rape culture of men and Me Too movement and things like that, it also fundamentally is rooted in the same myth, right? We have women who are these, you know, fragile things that we need to protect, and we have men who are like evil, barbaric, chaotic creatures that do everything to try to defile and corrupt and destroy women, right? It's the mythological narrative we exist in today. And or you might think about the modern racism, I mean white racism in this case, the alt-right, and people like that who basically utilize the same pattern pretty much. They say that, yeah, men are chaotic and evil and try to corrupt women, but only, you know, black men or whatever, Asian men. So it's a well, the same type of thinking, but only excluding white men, right, for alt-rights and other racists. Okay, so yeah, I think I've already exhausted the topic, but hopefully I was able to show you that this mythological scenario of the abduction of Europa and the Great Wall that you build around Europa to protect it from being abducted is something very actual, like it's present in modern culture in this very vivid form, and it's so it seems to be an archetypal type of story. So it's like ever present everywhere and all the time. Okay, so yeah, one last thing I would like to mention is that I keep posting on my page, Eugene the Philosopher, and Facebook, the aphorisms. I post roughly once per day, at least I'm trying to do that. Like sometimes I forget. So yeah, be sure to check it out when you have time. So thank you for watching. The eons are closing.